Good morning, everybody. This is Sunday, December 6th, and in a moment I'll be presenting to you lecture number 6 for our driver's ed course. Before I begin, however, I would like to remind you that you will be taking a midterm soon. And I've decided what we're going to do is we will have lecture 6 today with the assignment due next Saturday. And then we will have lecture 7 next weekend, as we've been doing. And I will not attach an assignment to lesson 7 because sometime during the week of December 13th, that 13th, 14th week, just before the Christmas break, you're going to take a midterm based on lessons 1 through 7. But my feeling is, since you will want to take time during that week to study lessons 1 through 7, I'm not going to add another lesson to it. In other words, I'm not going to have you do questions on lesson 7 and study for your midterm. Okay, you'll be expected to take notes on the lecture for 7, and you'll be expected to know them as part of your studying for your midterm. And the midterm will be during that week. Okay, and I'm probably going to set it up in a way that I won't have everybody, taking it whenever they want. I'm going to have certain set times where I'm going to ask you to submit. But I'll give you all that information as we go along. Okay? So anyway, today is lecture number 6, and the assignment then for today that I'll post, that I will email to you later, is going to be due next Saturday by midnight, which would be the 12th of December. Okay, and today we're going to talk about traffic laws. Now, as you would expect, traffic laws are designed so that drivers know what is expected of them, and also to be able to predict the behavior of other people. So again, the two prongs of traffic laws, the two real purposes of them, are to obviously prevent crashes and promote orderly flow of traffic. But that's done in a way that drivers know what is expected of them, and they also can predict what other people are doing. Keep in mind, at the turn of the 20th century, when cars first came into existence, there was no such thing as traffic laws, and obviously there were far fewer cars on the road, and the roads were very different. But there were really cars going every which way. There were many pedestrians and passengers and drivers killed because there was just mayhem. And it was only probably in maybe the 1920s when this country, because of the volume of cars and because the automobile became a part of so many people's lives, not just the wealthy but others as well, that traffic laws and roads had to be designed in ways that would create some uniformity. Okay, so obviously they serve a very important purpose. Now, the certain things that characteristics, I should say, of traffic laws that you should be aware of. Number 1, they ensure that drivers are qualified to operate a motor vehicle on public roadways. Okay. And when we talk about those kinds of traffic laws, we're talking about what would be administrative laws, which I'm going to get into in a moment. In other words, the laws of licensing and road test and so on. So number 1, traffic laws are to ensure that drivers are qualified to operate a motor vehicle on public roadways. Okay. Number 2, as we mentioned, traffic laws help roadway users to better predict what other roadway users will do. Number 3, they provide rules for highway use behavior. And number 4, they serve as guides for law enforcement and courts. And that's important because, if you're part of law enforcement or if you're in a courtroom, if you're a judge, you have to have certain standards to go by when issuing violations or making decisions about driver's behavior. Okay, so the 4 characteristics that I want you to absorb regarding traffic laws and their purpose. Number one, they ensure that drivers are qualified to operate a motor vehicle on public roadways. Number two, they help highway users, roadway users, better predict what other roadway users will do. Number three, they provide rules for roadway use behavior. And number four, they serve as guides for law enforcement and the courts. Now, when we talk about traffic laws, they are based on what's called a uniform vehicle code. Okay, uniform vehicle code. And that uniform vehicle code governs the following. So it's very broad in its heading. Number one, licensing. Number two, financial responsibility. Number three, vehicle ownership. Number four, rules of the road. Number five, vehicle operation. And number six, driver condition. I'm going to repeat those six things, so don't worry, okay? But there's something called the Uniform Vehicle Code. And the Uniform Vehicle Code is the umbrella under which all traffic laws exist, okay? And there are six components of that code that are, in a sense, governed by traffic laws. Number one, licensing. Number two, financial responsibility. Number three, vehicle ownership. Number four, rules of the road. Number five, vehicle operation. And number six, driver condition. And we're going to be talking about all of those six things. Okay, most of them today, and one or two of them I think are going to carry over into next week. The first major category of traffic laws that I would like to address is under the heading of administrative laws. And administrative laws are laws that establish procedures for such things as driver licensing, motor vehicle registration, financial responsibility, and vehicle equipment standards. And I'm going to repeat that in a moment, but I do want to make a distinction between administrative laws and actual rules of the road, okay? Administrative laws are the laws that govern all of the logistics of, owning a vehicle, getting a license, that bureaucratic situation. So the things that fall under the category of administrative laws would be driver licensing, motor vehicle registration, financial responsibility, and vehicle equipment standards. Financial responsibility, the biggest example, we'll talk a little bit about it now and later, is of course car insurance. And vehicle equipment standards, cars that have to be suitable for the road, okay? Your car has to be safe, has to be running properly, all right? So let's start with licensing. And by the way, all of these laws, or most of these laws, really are under the jurisdiction of the states. Okay. Now there's certain distinct commonalities. So if I'm driving in New York, and I have a New York license, and then I go out to California and I'm driving in California, my New York license is good for me to drive in California. You don't need a different license for every state. And the laws of the road in California would be very similar, thankfully, to the laws in New York or any other part of the country, but there may be certain individual or less significant distinctions that, we can adjust to. But while it is governed by the individual state, in other words, there are standards. If you have a license and you go from state to state, you're going to be fine. You have to adapt to certain things, but you're going to be okay. And the first category of administrative laws that I want to address is, of course, driver licensing. And right off the bat, I think especially if you have friends who live in other states, states vary in how they handle driver licensing. For instance, in New Jersey, if you take a road test in parts of Jersey, you take it in an open lot where there's cones. In New York, you take it on the street, okay? In some states, you can get your learner's permit at 15, you get your driver's license at 16. In New York, it's 16 and 17. So it does vary from state to state. But the driver's license is granted by the individual state. And of course, as we know, it gives a person permission to operate a motor vehicle. And as I said to you from the beginning, passing a road test does not mean you're necessarily a good driver. You've met the basic requirements, okay? It's only experience that makes you a good driver. And remember, we said that the standard that is looked at is the 5-year mark. You know, if you've been driving for 5 years, you're considered to be on par with the average qualified driver. So it is experience that's important. So your first license. Well, with your first license, of course, you have to demonstrate an understanding of traffic laws. And pretty much in every state, it's the same. In other words, you have to pass a written test. And that's what you pass. Many of you have done this already to get your learner's permit. You will have to pass a vision test. When you get your learner's permit, they give you a test of your vision. And if you're like me and you need glasses or contacts, you have to be able to show that you have proper vision with corrective lenses. And thus it will say on your license eventually corrective lenses, meaning that, again, if you're like me, I have to have my glasses on when I drive or contact lenses, okay? And you can get obviously in trouble if you're pulled over and you're driving and you have corrective lenses on your license, but you're not wearing those corrective lenses. So you pass the written test, you pass the vision test, and then, of course, demonstrate the basic ability to operate a motor vehicle, which, of course, is your road test. So that's what we do for our first license, okay? Nothing new there, right? Another point about license, the next point about licenses that I'd like to mention has to do with the fact that your license can be taken away from you, and you know that, right? If your violation or violations are serious enough, you could have your license suspended or revoked. Remember, driving is a privilege. It is not a right. So, the standard that's held to you is a little different than it would be for your basic rights as an American. Okay, I'm not saying they can just take your license away at a whim. There has to be a reason. But, that bar is not necessarily as high as you might expect. And there are two distinct ways in which your license can be taken away. One is suspension. One is revocation. So, and that depends on the severity, okay, of your situation. Let's talk about suspension. Suspension is a temporary removal of your license. It's generally less than a year, okay? It may be for 6 months to a year, depending on the state, depending on the severity of your offense. Your license is suspended. After 6 months or whatever, your license is returned to you, okay? So suspension is temporary. Revocation, to have your license revoked, is a permanent situation. It's much more serious than suspension. Your license is completely taken away from you. Now, understand something. If your license is revoked, generally speaking, after a year is usually the standard for revocation, okay? It could be longer, could be less, depending on the state, but typically it's a year. After a year, you have the option of applying for a new license. Remember, it's not the same license. A revocation is serious. It's taken away. But the law allows you the opportunity to redeem yourself. If your license has been taken away, after a year's time, you can go before a judge, an arbitrator, and you can make your case, and they can decide whether they want to give you the opportunity to get a new license. And remember, it's a new license. So you would have to go through the things you went through the first time on a revocation as opposed to a suspension. You would have to take a written test, you would have to take a road test, and you would get a brand new license. Okay? And as far as licenses are concerned, in every state, there's something called the point system. When you are found guilty of a traffic violation, speeding, red light, you run a red light, something that's known as a moving violation, okay? You not only do you get a traffic summons, you get a ticket, you have to pay a fine. You also get what's called points on your license. Points on your license is a bad thing. You don't want points on your license. And the severity of your offense will determine how many points go on your license. And it varies from state to state, district to district, okay? There's not one standard across the country. But understand that the more serious your violation, the more points on your license. And that's a bad thing. And the main reason it's a bad thing is because, number one, if you accumulate too many points, you can have your license suspended or revoked. Number two, that is reported to your insurance company. And your policy might see you as a higher risk. And so they might raise your premium, or they might drop you altogether. Okay? So you don't want points on your license. Typically, depending on how many points, depending on the severity of the situation, if you have points on your license over a period of time, they will go away. Okay? You also have opportunities to take classes. You may have to take a 3-hour class if you want, or a 4-hour class or whatever, to get rid of the points. And a lot of people do that when they're given the opportunity, because they can work off the points by being retrained, so to speak. And that is, something your insurance company will look upon to your advantage typically, okay? There's something called, now again, understand licenses are issued by the state. So you've got 50 states, you've got 50 jurisdictions. But there is something called a National Driver Register. National Driver Register. And basically that's a database of chronic problem drivers, okay? Your name goes on that list. So let's suppose I have, my license has been suspended in New York, and I'm driving, say, in California. I get pulled over. The officer can, run my license, and he'll see what happened with me in New York. He'll see whatever summonses I have. He'll see if my license has been suspended or revoked. It does go on that national register, thankfully. So you don't go from state to state and think that you eliminate, you've wiped away. There's no record of what you did in another state, okay? Let's talk again, administrative laws. So we've talked about licensing. The next category under administrative laws has to do with financial responsibility. All drivers must show proof of the ability to pay for damages from a collision, regardless of who is at fault. And if you fail to show proof, even if you're pulled over for a routine stop, and the officer sees you don't have insurance, you don't have the financial responsibility, your license does get suspended or revoked, okay? It's a very, very serious thing. I can't emphasize enough how serious it is for you to be driving without the proper financial responsibility, okay? And that's regardless of what car you drive, it's regardless of your age, it's regardless of your driving record, regardless of what state you're in. You must be able to prove that you have financial responsibility, that you can cover expenses in the event of a collision, even if it's not your fault, okay? So having said that, most ways in which in most states in this country, financial responsibility is established through insurance policies. Most of us, understand that you need to have car insurance. You have to get an insurance company to cover you. You have to pay them, a monthly annual rate, okay? That rate is going to be higher or lower depending on your age. Your age group, it's always higher because you're considered a higher risk than, say, my age group. Again, points on your license. If you have, moving violations, you could lose. That company could drop you, or you could get higher rates because you're considered a higher risk. So number one, the first way and the most common way and the most widespread way that you show financial responsibility is through automobile insurance. There are some states, and I don't know what states they are, so I can't tell you that off the top of my head. But there are some states, and there aren't many, but there are some states that allow you to drive without insurance, but in place of insurance, you need to pay a certain amount of money into a fund, a state fund, that is used to establish financial responsibility for those who have paid into it. Okay? Typically, and if you're in that state, you have the option, if you're in one of those states, you have the option either of depositing money or bonds or security or whatever financial collateral you can provide that goes directly into that fund. Or if you don't want to do that, you get, like everybody else, an insurance policy. Typically, people who aren't well off get the insurance policy. That fund is usually, for people who have a substantial amount of collateral of money. Okay, it's typically more costly than an insurance policy, but I think there are people who will do that because rather than deal with the regulations of an insurance company and their stipulations and their whims, there may be advantages to them to deposit into that fund. Okay? And again, as I said, high-risk drivers, depending on your age group or your violations, whatever they may be, the points on your license, that will determine the kind of premium that you pay with your insurance company. Now, administrative laws also govern vehicle ownership, registration, inspection. Now, a few quick words on each of them. There's something called a certificate of title. The certificate of title, every car on the road must have a certificate of title. And that certificate of title has the name of the owner of that car. Whoever owns that car is on the title. Okay, when you buy a car, you get that title. If you're buying a used car, that title gets transferred from one person to another. Okay, if you're buying it from a dealer, the dealer is it's part of the paperwork. You get that title. Of course, you have to pay for it. Okay, and on that title is your name and address, your vehicle body style. So is it a sedan? Is it a two-door? Is it a truck? Whatever kind of car it is. Okay, how many cylinders on your engine is. Okay, how powerful your engine is. All right. There's a serial number, and there's something called a vehicle identification number, which is shortened as VIN or VIN, a VIN number. Every single car on the road has a distinct VIN number. Okay, and that VIN number, it identifies that car. And that is your vehicle identification number, and it appears on your title. So remember, the certificate of title has the owner's name on it and the owner's address. It tells you what type of car it is, the body style, the make. It tells you how many cylinders your engine is, how big or powerful the car is. It has a specific serial number, and it also has a VIN number, vehicle identification number. And then there's something called a vehicle registration. That's something separate. And every vehicle must be registered with the appropriate state agency, the Motor Vehicles Department, okay? And you have to pay, and you have to renew that registration. And that, depending on the state, that registration is renewable either once a year. It could be anywhere between 1 year and 4 years. Okay, some states you have to renew it every 2 years. Some states let you renew it every 4 years. But regardless of what the time frame is, you have to make sure that when that time is up, you go to motor vehicles. Sometimes, you can just mail it in. You mail in your fee. They'll send it to you. Okay, whatever the process is, you have to make sure you re-register your car. Otherwise, if your car is parked on the road and your registration is expired, you will get a ticket. Okay, so you've got to make sure you take care of that. And the other thing that's important is what's called vehicle inspection. Your car has to be deemed worthy to be on the road. It has to be deemed safe. Okay, and so usually it's once a year. You have an inspection certificate. When it's ready to expire, you go to your mechanic. You get the mechanic to check your car and to renew your inspection. And the main thing they check, I mean, they'll check major things. It's not one thing they check, but it is the main thing that they check, and that's engine emissions. In other words, and this really started probably back in the early 70s when, we became much more conscious of our environment, of air pollution. Cars were putting out a significant amount of carbon monoxide, all kinds of other bad things into the air. And so cars started to become designed differently, more efficient, more environmentally friendly. And so now there are certain standards that a car must meet in terms of the gases that it emits into the environment. And they usually, a mechanic will have a machine, and they put your car in the machine and to test the emissions. That's actually the main thing they check on your vehicle inspection. Okay? Okay, so that's administrative laws. Now we move to what we'll call rules of the road. All right? And every state has what's called a motor vehicle code, which is the umbrella for which the rules of the road fall under. Okay? And today we're going to talk about some, general categories of rules of the road, regardless of what state you're in. We start with right-of-way laws. Right-of-way laws are designed to help drivers understand who should be granted the privilege of proceeding first when more than one vehicle approaches an intersection at about the same time. Let me repeat that. Right-of-way laws are designed to help drivers understand who should be granted the privilege of proceeding first when more than one vehicle approaches an intersection at about the same time. Okay? And there's a very important stipulation on right-of-way, and that is that the driver can never take the right-of-way. Right-of-way has to be given, not taken. So, for instance, if I'm in a stop sign and there's cross traffic, okay, unless the car is far enough away, if that car is within, the vicinity, a range that could be dangerous, if I proceeded, I have to give the right-of-way to that car because I'm at the stop sign and he doesn't have a light or a stop sign. I have to give him the right-of-way. He can't take it because if I don't give it to him, he doesn't get it, right? If I keep going and, he's not getting the right-of-way, I'm not giving it to him. So right-of-way has to be given. It's not taken. And you should never assume that right-of-way will be given to you. And that comes under the category, and we'll talk more about this later, of what we call defensive driving. And I've touched on this already. You always want to assume that the other person is going to do the wrong thing. So the idea is to be careful, not to be deliberate enough that you hinder traffic or that you're panic stricken or whatever. But, the idea is if you see he has a stop sign, yes, you keep going, but he's in your peripheral vision. You're careful enough to know that if he is to blow that stop sign, you will see him doing it and you hopefully can avoid the accident. So you don't want to assume that right-of-way will be given to you. And as a matter of fact, once in a while I said I would throw statistics at you. I did in the beginning. The Federal Highway Administration conducted a study some time ago, and they looked at 40,000 drivers at stop signs. And they discovered out of those 40,000 drivers, 2/3 of them failed to stop at the stop sign. I'll repeat that. Let that sink in. Out of 40,000 drivers, 2/3 of them, and they studied all these drivers at stop signs, 2/3 of those 40,000 drivers failed to stop at the stop sign. So we're talking about roughly 30,000+, okay, of the 40,000. So that, I think, should drive home the point I'm making about defensive driving. Now, some principles of right-of-way. Number one, The purpose of right-of-way laws is to prevent conflicts resulting when one driver fails to yield to another. I'll repeat that. Number one, the first principle is that right-of-way laws are designed to prevent conflicts resulting from when one driver fails to yield to another. Okay? Number two, as we said before, right-of-way is always given. It is not something a driver should take for granted. Okay? Number three, to be granted right-of-way, for a driver to give me right-of-way, that driver must be driving in a lawful manner. Okay? A driver cannot take the right-of-way. The right-of-way, as we said, has to be given. So a driver cannot take the right-of-way by breaking another law. Okay? Number four, a driver has not yielded the right-of-way if he's forcing another driver to slow down or wait. So for instance, if I'm at a stop sign and a car is right there and he doesn't have a stop sign or a light, he's just going, right? I should not act in a way that's going to force him to slow down or stop and wait for me. He should be able to go smoothly, maintaining his speed because of my giving him the right of way. So, sometimes, you see a car at a stop sign and they come out real far, right? Maybe they stop eventually, but they come out real far further than they have to. And you're driving and you end up putting your foot on the brake, maybe not stopping short, but slowing down. He's not giving you the right of way, even though he's not running the stop sign. You should be able to, the flow of traffic should be able to go steadily. All right? And number five, the last principle I would mention here is that whoever has the last chance to avoid a collision should do so. Putting all the laws aside, the reality is if you can avoid a collision, you avoid it, period, right? And that should be instinctual. If a guy blows a stop sign, I'm supposed to have the right of way. He's not giving me the right of way. I obviously want to avoid as best as possible hitting him. I don't want to hit him and then tell the officer, oh, he blew the stop sign. I mean, if it's unavoidable, it's unavoidable. But of course, if you can avoid it, you will avoid it. The best example I can give to that is a pedestrian. It's a myth that pedestrians always have the right of way. Okay? If they're in the crosswalk, typically, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, they do have the right of way. Okay, depending on the circumstances, but that's typically when the pedestrian has the right of way. If they're crossing anywhere else but the crosswalk, they don't have the right of way. However, if a guy's crossing at the middle of the street and I'm driving down, yeah, he's wrong if he's walking out into the street. I'm not going to run him over and tell the officer, well, officer, I'm sorry, but, he didn't have the right of way. He crossed outside the crosswalk, so I ran him over and killed him. Of course you're not going to do that. You're going to give way to him, even though he's wrong. Okay, so if you can avoid the collision, obviously you want to avoid the collision. And speaking of pedestrians are supposed to cross in the crosswalk. And if there's no crosswalk, it should be, at the corner, okay? You can kind of visualize the crosswalk, all right? And the rule of the crosswalk is that when there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk, and I explain it to students in the car this way, if the pedestrian is on my side of the crosswalk, so let's say it's a two-way street. So it's a big crosswalk, covers my lane, and it covers the other lane. If the pedestrian is in my half of the street, I have to wait for him to clear my half before I can go. If he's now crossing in the other side, where the traffic is coming from the other direction, he's away from my half of the street, and I can proceed. Okay? Now, if it's a one-way street, obviously the crosswalk is smaller, and that pedestrian anywhere in that crosswalk has the right of way. I have to wait until that pedestrian steps foot onto the pavement on the other side. All right? So make sure you understand that. When you're driving on the road and you're on a two-way street and there's a crosswalk, the pedestrian that's on your half of the road, he has the right of way. Once he crosses the center of the road and goes to the other half, in the other lane where the traffic's coming in the other direction, you can proceed now. If it's a one-way street, smaller crosswalk, Pedestrian anywhere in that crosswalk has the right of way. Okay? So, some instances where we encounter right of way, okay, in circumstances where right of way is comes into play. Number one, stop signs. Now, understand that, and we're going to talk about stop signs a little more in a moment, but there is a distinction between a regular stop sign and what's called an all-way stop sign, where underneath the stop sign itself it says all way. We'll talk about that in a minute. Obviously, lights, red lights. Lane changing. You don't just change lanes. If a car is coming up on your side, he has the right of way. Alleys and driveways. If you're backing out of your driveway, any traffic that's coming, they have the right of way. A yield sign, yield by its very definition means give up the right of way. Okay, so if you see a yield sign, you're approaching a yield sign, you have to give the right of way to whatever traffic is coming, crossing. Okay? Cars within an intersection, they always have the right of way. So suppose I'm waiting to make a left turn, and I'm waiting for oncoming traffic, right? I'm sitting in the middle of the intersection. The light changes now, so that oncoming traffic has a red light, and I have a red light. It's above me, maybe a little behind me. And the cars coming this way have a green light. I'm in the middle of the intersection. I'm still waiting to make my left turn. Those cars who have the green light have to wait for me to get out of the intersection before they proceed, okay? So cars within the intersection always have the right of way. You have to let them go, okay? If you're merging onto a highway, traffic that's coming in that right lane, you want to make sure it's safe before you can go. You have to give up the right of way. Authorized vehicles, standard rule, if there's an ambulance with its siren going behind me, I pull over, give the ambulance the right of way. Funeral processions, and you've seen them, okay? Usually people in a funeral procession, they have their hazard lights on, their flashing lights on. The lead car is the hearse. Now that hearse has to obey traffic laws. Understand that. The lead car is obligated to stop at a red light at a stop sign. However, if you're in that funeral procession, the idea is to keep the line together, and you're approaching a red light, you have the traffic that's coming the other way has the obligation to let you go. You don't want to break up a funeral procession. So you are authorized to go through that red light, okay? So if you see a funeral procession, just make sure you don't cross it. If you have to wait at your green light or your stop sign for a while, you have to wait, okay? You want that whole procession to pass uninterrupted. And of course, school buses. And a school bus will typically have if it has the flashing red lights, you have to stop, and you have to stop on both sides. Oftentimes they have the flashing red lights and they put out the stop sign. So you have both. But if, regardless of which direction you're coming from, the flashing red lights, the stop sign for a school bus, you must stop. And it's a big fine if you don't. And in some places, and I think New York has instituted this recently, if you go past a school bus that has the flashing red lights, you could have your license automatically suspended. So it's a very big deal, okay? Talk more about traffic control devices. So again, the category there would be more lights and signs, all right? Obviously, all drivers have to obey these traffic control devices. Understand, authorized personnel supersede those devices. So here's what I mean by that. If a cop is directing traffic, there's a red light above you and the cop is waving you on, that cop supersedes the red light, right? Or if you're approaching a construction site and your lane is blocked and the sign man is carrying a sign that tells you slow and he's waving you on to cross into the other lane, he supersedes the law that would say you shouldn't. You have to get around that obstruction, okay? Again, traffic signals as they apply to left turns, oncoming traffic. If it's a two-way street, you're making the left turn. Oncoming traffic has the right of way. You may be the oncoming traffic. So you may see the car sitting in the intersection waiting to make that left turn. He should be giving you the right of way. okay? And of course, as we said, pedestrians in the crosswalk. As far as lights are concerned, steady yellow, the yellow light, I think I've mentioned this before. Slow down and prepare to stop if it's safe to do so. Sometimes it's safer to go through the yellow light. If you're just approaching that intersection and your green just goes to yellow, and for you to slow down and stop would mean stopping abruptly and risking the car behind you hitting you, then you're better off rolling through it. You don't want to speed through a yellow light, which a lot of people do, okay? If you can slow down and stop safely, you can. But again, if it's safer to go through it, you go through it. And sometimes even for experienced drivers like myself, it's tricky, okay? Steady red, of course, stop behind the crosswalk fully. You don't enter the intersection at all. If there's no crosswalk, you stop right behind where there would be, if there were one, right behind the curb, right behind the light, okay? Stop sign, stop behind the crosswalk. Now, in your car, you're probably learning on a regular stop sign, you should stop twice. So you come to a complete stop, not a roll. Complete stop behind the crosswalk. You're completely motionless. And I always tell students, in your head, count to 3. Why you want to be completely motionless for 3 seconds. So you've stopped, 1, 2, 3. Then you roll out and you come to a second stop. Even if you see there's no traffic, on your road test, I would make sure you do that second stop. Okay, most of us blow past the first stop, right? And we do the second one if we stop at all, right? But you want to do 2 defined stops. 1 before the crosswalk, 1 after. Now, there are some stop signs, and you may have seen them already. There are some in the area in Staten Island, you'll see them, where underneath the stop sign it says all way. That means all 4 corners have a stop sign. And at those stop signs, you only have to stop once. And the rule is whoever gets there first goes. So if I'm approaching an all way and I see that there's a car stopped here, I come to my stop, he got there before me. So I wait for him to go. Okay? If I get to the all-way stop sign and there's nobody there, after my stop, I don't need the second stop. I just go. Okay? And the rule is typically, and this doesn't happen often, but if 2 people get there at the same time, it's always the car on the right that has the right of way. So when in doubt, yield to the car on the right, or he should yield to you. If there, and this has never happened to me, but if you have 3 cars getting there at the same time, again, the rule goes to the car on the right. Okay, so he would go, then he would go, then you would go if this is you. Okay? If 4 cars stop at the stop sign at the same exact time, then play the lottery because, you've experienced something highly unusual. You'll probably never experience that. And if that happens, then you all just have to cooperate, wave each other on somehow. Again, avoid collision at any cost. Let's talk a little bit about speed laws. Obviously, speed limit signs are there, speed laws are there to create safe driving. Vehicle speed encompasses, and we talked about this, time, visibility, and space. So speed limits are all designed around those 3 things, okay? Time, visibility, and space. Now, time, visibility, and space are affected by such things as traffic density, road conditions, I'll repeat these, sight distance, visual field, and type of vehicles. Let me repeat that. The speed limits that you see on the road, the signs are there based upon the situation in that area. The traffic density, how much traffic is there in that area. The road conditions, if they're doing construction or the road winds, the speed limit may be lower. How far ahead you can see. If there's a curve and you can't see all that far ahead, the speed limit may come down. So again, you got to pay close attention to the signs. Visual field, can you take in the whole range, the 12 to 15 seconds, right? And what types of cars are typically on that road? Is it like the BQE has a lot of trucks on it, so the speed limit may be affected that way. I always tell students in the city, and you've probably discovered this in your cars, in the city, the speed limit, unless you see a sign, you assume it's 25. Okay? I'll repeat that. If you don't see a sign, you assume the speed limit is 25. Now, if you're on Highland Boulevard, you're going to see the speed limit will go up to 30. It could go up in some places to 40. You go on the highway, it goes up to 55. It can go on some interstate highways, 65 or 70. Okay? I would make this point about speed limits, that they are designed for ideal conditions. So let's suppose I'm on a street where the speed limit sign says 30, and it's raining pretty hard, and I'm doing 30, and I get pulled over by the officer, and he's ready to give me a speeding ticket. And he says, you were doing 30 miles an hour. And I say to him, but officer, the sign said 30. He can give me that ticket because of the driving conditions, okay? He can determine in his judgment that I should have slowed down because the conditions were not ideal. So, if it's raining, if it's snowing, if it's icy, you have to make the adjustment. Not just because you can get a ticket, but because it's dangerous if you don't. That speed limit is there for ideal conditions. A nice dry day, okay, where visibility is clear, there's no fog, there's no rain. That's why that speed limit sign is there. Okay, that's what it applies to. And there's oftentimes, particularly on highways, you might see signs for a minimum speed limit. Now, in the city, on regular roads, you're typically not going to see signs for a minimum speed limit. But use your common sense. If the speed limit is 40 and you're doing 20, you're probably going too slow. Okay? If you're doing 35 and the speed limit is 40, that's fine. I would say maybe a range of 5 miles per hour, slower is pretty much acceptable. What you don't want is that you're going, the reason for the minimum speed limit is that, you don't want to hinder traffic. If people can't pass you, you're on a 40 mile an hour speed limit street and you're doing 20, you're backing up traffic. So, you need to keep that in mind, okay? Typically, we drive on the right side of a road, and in most countries, I shouldn't say most countries, believe it or not, most parts of the world, and this is hard to believe, most parts of the world are like England, where you drive on the left side. And that's because the British Empire was so powerful. It controlled so many parts of the world at one time that rule of the law of the road applied in places, and still does, in places like India or South Africa, or there are parts of the world that were once part of the British Empire. Okay? In this country, in most European countries, we drive to the right. Okay? Okay. Emergency vehicles, if you're in the right lane, you pull over to the right side, all right? If you see an emergency vehicle, so if a car is coming behind you, you pull over to the right. If you see an emergency vehicle is in your lane, okay, what you want to do, if there's more than one lane, what you want to do is, if you pass him, you want to get at least one lane to the left. You don't want to pass him close. Okay, so if there's two lanes, you get over in advance, you get over into the left lane and you can pass him. Okay? If there's nowhere for you to go, he's basically blocking your lane, then you want to slow down. The key number is 20 miles an hour. So if I'm doing 30 and I see an emergency vehicle in my lane, I'm going to bring it down to 10, 15 miles an hour and, pass him very, very slowly, okay? And the same thing with this, if you're in the left lane and there's an emergency vehicle ahead, if you could pass him on the right lane, as long as you're one lane over, you can do that, okay? If there's no lane and there's no right lane, slow down by 20 miles per hour, approach very slowly, and go around him that way, okay? Following too closely. I've told you many times the rule that I always use is 1 car length for every 10 miles an hour is a simple rule to remember. Signaling before a turn or before a lane change. The typical measurement that we go by is 100 feet. So you want to signal about 100 feet from the corner, okay? If you're like me, I'm not that good at judging, distances like that. This is 100 feet. Well, what is that? If you have trouble with that a little bit, I would say if it's a regular block, maybe half a block or a little less than half a block away, you can signal, okay? But roughly 100 feet from the corner. If you're making a right turn, we typically move over before our turn as far to the right as possible. If we're making a left turn, we move over as far to the left as possible. Sometimes there's a designated lane for a left turn. Left turn only. You need to be in that lane if you're making that left turn. And remember, if you're making that left turn, you need to give up the right of way to ongoing traffic. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about today is in the category of aggressive and reckless driving. Aggressive and reckless driving laws. Let's start with reckless driving. Reckless driving, by definition, involves improper driving and driving acts such as speeding, failure to yield right of way, or turning from the wrong lane. Those are two of the most common examples that could fall in the category of reckless driving. Speeding, failure to yield right of way, turning from the wrong lane. Okay, improper driving acts. But there is a stipulation attached to reckless driving, and this would be in it would be the assessment of the law enforcement officer, because there's a difference between reckless driving and a simple moving violation. Suppose I go through a stop sign, I can get a stop sign ticket. But suppose the officer sees me going through a stop sign, and in his or her judgment, it is deemed that I was reckless, then I will get a bigger ticket. I will get more points added on. Reckless driving is serious. It's more serious than a simple moving violation, okay? So to be in the category of reckless driving, it's generally in an extreme case, all right? So there are certain conditions that make it extreme. And there are really three that would uphold a reckless driving charge. And by the way, remember, when a police officer gives you a ticket, it's a complaint. You always have the right, says right on the ticket, to fight it. You can have your day in court, okay? And a judge can throw it out if you prove your case. We're always innocent until proven guilty, okay? But if an officer gives you a ticket and that ticket falls in the category of reckless driving, he has determined that there are three conditions that were met for him to give you that ticket. Number one, you were driving consciously and intentionally in a dangerous manner. Okay? You didn't just happen to miss the light. You consciously and intentionally went through the light. Okay? Number two, you should know, or you do know. Either way, ignorance is no excuse. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. You should know, or you do know, that your behavior has put others at risk. And number three, there are conditions surrounding you that make the risk more obvious and serious. For instance, certain conditions like time and place of the occurrence. Let's suppose it's 2:30 and you're near a school, right? Weather, traffic volume, if it's a very busy area and you're doing something crazy. The condition of your vehicle. Maybe your vehicle is in some way hindered. You have a big dent in the front left side that the officer deems could contribute to the danger. Okay? And your condition. Are you overly fatigued? Are you under the influence of alcohol or drugs? Okay, are you sick? All right? So, three conditions to uphold reckless driving. Number one, the driver consciously and intentionally drives in a dangerous manner. Number two, the driver knows or should know that his or her behavior places others at risk. And number three, the conditions make the increase in risk obvious and serious. And such conditions could include time and place of occurrence, the weather, the traffic volume in that area, the condition of your vehicle, and your own condition as the driver. Okay? And in essence, there's probably the most serious example of reckless driving is when conditions of being willful and wanton apply. Willful and wanton, wanton meaning W-A-N, spelled W-A-N-T-O-N, which has to do with, being careless, okay? Purpose or willingness to commit an act without regard for the rights or safety of others. So that's an important condition that's often associated, that's an important factor that's often associated with reckless driving. Willful and wanton behavior, where there's purpose or willingness to commit an act without regard for the rights or safety of others. Now, there's also a type of driving known as aggressive driving. And aggressive driving are behaviors that indicate an aggressive mindset, but they're not necessarily directed at a particular driver, okay? So I would say reckless driving would fall under certainly the category of aggressive driving. So, for instance, running red lights, changing lanes suddenly, all right, or following too closely are primary examples of aggressive driving. Running red lights, changing lanes suddenly, following too closely. And the best way I always like to say this to students is that aggressive driving is more serious than reckless driving. I always say that, an officer will determine an aggressive driving circumstance based on how severe it is, okay? There's reckless driving, which is very bad. There's aggressive driving, which is even worse. And the distinction between aggressive driving and road rage is important, because road rage is behavior that is directed at specific vehicles or occupants. And we see this a lot, especially in Staten Island. Behaviors directed at specific vehicles or occupants with malicious intent. Okay? Some examples of road rage. And again, it's when you act towards somebody maliciously. You're trying to hurt them in some way. Ramming their car, sideswiping their car, throwing objects at their car, rolling down your window and yelling, that's road rage. Getting out and hitting somebody is road rage. Even rude and obscene gestures, giving somebody the finger, is road rage. And of course, shooting somebody, discharging a firearm would be road rage. So it's behavior that's malicious towards other people. And it can be as extreme as shooting somebody or as seemingly minor as giving somebody the finger. You're directing a malicious act at somebody else on the road. And my advice to students always is if somebody, gives you the finger or somebody cuts you off, let them go, because you don't know who you're dealing with. There's always somebody crazier than you on the road, okay? And you don't know who you're dealing with. Let the person go, and if, God forbid, you're in a situation where there's danger, you've got your cell phone, roll up your window, lock your doors, call 911, okay? And the last point I will make is when we talk about things like road rage and aggressive driving and reckless driving, and that could lead to what's known as vehicular homicide. And that's obviously an extreme case of any of these things, where someone behaves unlawfully and unintentionally. Okay, vehicular homicide is not necessarily that you wanted to kill somebody, but you behaved in such a reckless way that you caused the death of another person while you were violating driving laws, state laws, okay? And, you obviously, if you're convicted of vehicular homicide, you're going to jail. You're going to serve time, okay? So vehicular homicide is where the death of somebody results from a person's even unintentional, okay, behavior that violates the law on the road. Now, the last part of this unit, which I'm not going to get to today, has to do with driver condition. We're going to start talking about, things like alcohol and its effects on you and fatigue and things like that. But I've already gone on for close to an hour, so I decided to start with that next week and then move into Unit 7, okay? All right, thank you everybody for your attention. I'll send out the assignment later today, and enjoy the rest of the weekend.